It's been referred to as China's second continent in the past. And in fact, they've invested something like $200 billion in the continent over recent years, building vast infrastructure projects, extracting critical minerals for use by Chinese renewable energy companies. But I think increasingly with the competition with the West, the battle for influence in Africa is becoming even more important because it coincides with a downturn in the Chinese economy, a reduction in the amount of aid that's going to Africa from China, and a far greater wariness within.
African leaders have gathered in Beijing today for a summit which signals China's continuing influence on the continent. The Chinese President Xi Jinping promised the leaders billions of dollars in loans and private investment over the next 3 years. This builds on the relations cultivated since the founding of the China-Africa Forum in 2000 and under the Belt and Road programme, which has seen Chinese development banks make loans to build railways, roads and other infrastructure under Xi's Belt Road programme. Well, joining me now is Ian Williams, former China correspondent and author of Vampire State, The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Ian, good evening.
Good evening, Kate.
Good to speak to you. Is this part of China's plan to build an anti-Western alliance? Is this China's way of not only, well, they've done a pretty good job actually of making us reliant on them for certain things, but does this bed China into the African continent?
I think it's becoming more and more seen that way in Beijing. Africa has long been seen as being under Beijing's influence. It's been referred to as China's second continent in the past. And in fact, they've invested something like $200 billion in the continent over recent years, building vast infrastructure projects, extracting critical minerals for use by Chinese renewable energy companies. But I think increasingly with the competition with the West, the battle for influence in Africa is becoming even more important because it coincides with a downturn in the Chinese economy, a reduction in the amount of aid that's going to Africa from China, and a far greater wariness within Africa of their own dependence upon China, which is very, very considerable.
Does China actually benefit economically from this investment in African countries?
I think it benefits two ways from Africa. One is economically because it's a very important source of raw materials for China, especially for renewable energy, critical minerals, lithium, for instance, for batteries, for EVs, but also for political influence, because there's a real correlation between the amount of money that China splashes on many of these countries and their willingness to support China at the UN and elsewhere on issues like Hong Kong, on Taiwan, on Xinjiang, where China is looking for diplomatic cover and looking for support. And the countries which are most in hock to Beijing are usually the most enthusiastic to back it.
There are political and military overtones here, of course. You know, China trains more military professionals in Africa than anywhere else. But Xi outlined 10 partnership actions today. They include training for African politicians and future leaders, further opening of Chinese markets, agriculture demonstration areas, vocational and technical training, green energy projects, and $1 billion, so $140 million in military assistance grants. So this goes beyond sort of investing in business. This is investing in Africa, isn't it? Thoroughly, politically. And
yeah. I mean, China has its first and only military base in Djibouti in Africa, and they have private security, quote unquote, on the continent, protecting some of their bigger assets, their bigger investments. But certainly Xi recognizes that the Chinese economy's power to seduce, if you like, in Africa is being reduced by the problems they have at home. There is massive indebtedness in China. Zambia has defaulted, so's Ghana, Ethiopia. Dozens of others are on the brink. And one of the reasons for the defaults is because of the huge amount of debt they're owed to China. And China has proven to be a very unforgiving, a very tough creditor, unlike Western institutions or the IMF that often forgive debt. China's been very reluctant to do that, has instead insisted on lending more to roll over the debt. And this has caused a certain amount of resentment. A lot of the investments that go in there involve Chinese companies, Chinese labor. There's very little transparency. For instance, in Kenya, there's huge controversy at the moment over a railway from Nairobi to Mombasa, which there have been allegations of irregularities and indeed whether the thing is even needed at all. So all this has contributed to a lot more wariness on the African continent towards China. And China's position is not as powerful as it was because of its reduction in its economic clout, the economic problems they've got at home, which means they have in recent years massively reduced the amount of aid going to Africa. This has come, of course, at a time when the West, Britain, Europe, the United States have recognized that they've got to step up in Africa in a way they
Mm.
haven't done before in order to counter
So
Chinese influence.
even though China's promising, billions of dollars, loans and private investment, even though that is being promised, you say that sort of China's starting to, that is perhaps less than it has been because of, China's slightly dwindling economy.
Yeah, I mean, there are two things here, really. There's Chinese pledges. China is very good at making promises and making pledges. It's the root of one of the problems with the Belt and Road initiatives. They're very big on pledges and promises, but the amount that's actually delivered often doesn't live up to that. And in fact, what we've seen over recent years is quite a significant reduction in the amount of Chinese aid for Africa and an increased wariness within Africa of their dependence on China and a recognition, these countries are transactional. They recognize they have more clout now. They can play countries off against each other. They can play the US off against China, off against Europe. And Xi recognizes that. And I think that underlying this plea today, I mean, he was talking about modernization doesn't mean westernization. We all share imperialist and colonial backgrounds. We've all suffered from it. But there are those in Asia that would regard, in Africa, that would regard China as the new colonialists. So
Mm.
I think Xi's felt that he's got to step up at this summit and perhaps go further in the promises that he is making. But there is a real question mark, I think, about whether they can be delivered and how plausible they're seen in Africa, where there is this greater skepticism than we saw before.
You have a new book out today. Happy publication day. It's called Vampire State: The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Just tell us a little bit about it.
Well, it tries to make sense of what the Chinese economy is, because,
It's
we,
hard to
we've
tell.
we talk a lot about, socialism with Chinese characteristics. There have been numerous ways of trying to describe it, but this beast that is the Chinese economy, which is addictive to many companies, but is also slightly surreal, quite threatening, very coercive, and very predatory. And I've tried to make sense of what makes this economy tick, why this addiction, why this attraction, and the real problems that the economy is facing in the years ahead. And I think these problems are bigger than at any time since the beginning
Mm.
of reform and opening, which itself is really being exposed as something which was more sort of tactical and more limited than people thought it would. And this is, the book was some time in the making, but I think it's interesting that it's now coming out at a time when companies, countries are having real doubts and second thoughts about the strength of the Chinese economy and
Yeah.
the inevitability as we
Yeah,
saw
and
it just a
also,
few years ago.
yeah, and we've had a lot within our own political system, a lot of questions about China, and how safe and secure it is to deal with China, the ramifications of that. Did people within China speak to you freely, Ian? Did you have
It's it's
issues or?
becoming it's becoming more and more difficult, Kate. I think one of the things that I've noticed over the years that I've been reporting from China and talking to people within China is the far greater degree of caution about what they will say openly. there is far greater surveillance. I mean, recently the Ministry of State Security, which is their main spy agency, effectively criminalized gloomy thinking. I mean, it said that, that people who are not positive about the economy and are spreading these lies about the economy not being in a wonderful state are somehow sort of Western stooges. And it's become much more difficult to get information out of China because they've cut down on formerly independent sources of information. It's become much more difficult to get people to speak freely because the atmosphere in Xi's China is becoming so much more repressive, even on things like the economy, where you might have expected in the past people to be a little bit more forthright because it's not seen as so political.
Yeah, and it's something to be proud of. Look, really interesting to speak to you. Thank you so much, Ian Williams, former China correspondent and author of the new book, The Vampire State: The Rise and Fall of the Chinese Economy. Good stuff. Thanks, Ian. Good to speak to you.
And you, thank you.